Welcome to this week's podcast. Hope you enjoyed recent podcasts. Fran, we've had a lot of comments about Fran and his ability to save for retirement. Then we had the wonderful Dan Hylett talking about the most dangerous day in retirement and preparing for the financial, but also and mostly the non-financial aspects of same. Preparing for that next chapter, as we like to call it. And this week, I bring some somber news in regards to some research around retirement and what we need to be thinking about. If you're like me, anytime we hear research in Ireland about what a comfortable retirement looks like, there's been research recently that we've quoted and spoken about here about what level of income we'll need to be comfortable in retirement. For some people, that will make sense and that will sound reasonable. And for others, there might be something small or large in the back of their minds saying that's not going to cut the mustard. And so this week, I'm going to share some research that may delight you or annoy the hell out of you. And either way, it's interesting and it's fact. Based on research that has been completed. And my intent in sharing it is to prompt action, to prompt thinking, to prompt planning. And if you do that thinking or planning or action and you want to disregard this, then that's fine too. That's your choice. Ultimately, it is a choice we all have to make. But it's a bit of a devil's advocate, a bit of a challenger view on things. Speaking of challenger view, I recently shared that we have been shortlisted for 2 financial service awards. They're the PwC FS awards, which happen every year for the last few years. They're independently judged. And you put in a submission, and if the judges deem that, hey, you got some credibility here and there's actually something tangible that you've done, that's my understanding anyway, at least of the criteria, as opposed to paying for it or sponsoring any events or seats or tables, you get shortlisted. So we've been shortlisted for 2 awards, the Trust Award and the Challenger Award. So we're thrilled to have been shortlisted. We're up against Revolut and a few others in that kind of space. So the finals are in October. So looking forward to that. And fingers crossed, our efforts in both sides of things in terms of trying to do things differently and also trying to do things in a really, really uber transparent and client-focused way will be recognized. But anyway, I'm waffling, so I'll stop. Underfunded retirements in Ireland and beyond, right? This is not necessarily going to be easy listening. Sometimes I feel I'm too soft, too nice. This week I'm not going to be. I'm deliberately going to be neither. And somewhat out of my comfort zone. And so that's the reality. In Ireland, the contributory state pension provides about $15,000 a year, $289 per week. Max rate for those with full contributions. CSO data shows that 56% of workers without private pensions expect to rely primarily on the state pension. 56%. And Tilda research has found that for households aged 65 plus, the state pension makes up roughly 2/3 of the gross income in the household. And 26% rely on state-funded income only. All right. And based on US research, the picture is pretty much the same there, right? Vanguard's How America Saves found that the median defined contribution plan, pension plan balance for 55 to 64-year-olds, so those that are towards the end of their working careers, hopefully for most, was under $100,000, was $95,000, and this was in 2024. And research by James Poterba shows that for Americans age 65 plus, public Pensions, Social Security account for 85% to 18% of incomes across the first to fourth income quartiles. So as much as 85% of household income in the US. All right. So it's not an Irish problem, and a lot of the research that we see is about, how Ireland pension savers were not prepared, etc. We are not unique, and indeed we're much better off than an awful lot of developed countries in terms of our preparedness, but we could do better ultimately. Okay, there's me trying to be nice again. Stop it, Paddy. Ultimately, we're not as prepared as we should be, right? And this is reinforced by recent research that I want to talk about by CCPC. They launched this research this month, September 2025, and it is by CCPC, which is the wonderfully named Competition and Consumer Protection Commission, which is based here in Ireland, state-funded, to research and to help protect consumers and inform and educate consumers. And they do tons of great work and research. They do much more than you would think. Check out their website, ccpc.ie. They have tons of really good tools and information there. They have approached a piece of research recently and shared the findings on it, and they approached it from a financial and pension coverage perspective. Here's some bullet points, okay? 60% of Irish adults have some form of pension. Fair play to us, okay? However, a significant 26% remain completely unprepared for retirement. So they have done nothing. They have no plans. They have no pension. They have no income apart from state pension aligned or planned or thought about. 11% of people intend to rely on rental income, all right? So where they rent out a property, I presume that would also include rent a room intentions. So 11% people, so 1 in 10 intend to rely on rental income. Interestingly enough, that 11% has approximately halved in the last 2 years. So it used to be 20% approx were going to rely on rental income. That's now down to 11%. Is that a good or a bad thing? I don't know. Why? Perhaps is that because landlords have stopped being landlords and sold the property? That seems to be a trend, of course, based on research and stuff you'll read. But that's the fact. 1/3 of pension holders regret not starting their contributions earlier. I'm not sure why 2/3 don't regret not starting earlier. And maybe they started as early as they could, or maybe it was a case simply, well, look, there wasn't an option for me, perhaps. 36% of pension holders are unsure how pensions work. And I'm kind of surprised it's 36% only in a lot of ways. But hey, a lot of people ultimately don't understand how pensions work or how they'll access the funds or when they can access the funds, perhaps. 66% of people have never spoken to a financial advisor in a professional capacity, I assume, right? Which is a big number. And particularly when we know the correlation between those that have and work with a financial advisor and the level of wealth that they accumulate over time and the level of returns that they achieve over time. 60% have little to no understanding of how auto enrollment, which is starting in January of next year or due to start in January of 2026, they've no understanding of how it will work. Have little to no understanding of how AE will work and My Future Fund, as it's branded. And only 27% of those who responded that have no pension coverage expect to be enrolled in auto enrollment, which is also quite interesting, given that the majority, it's not everybody, you have to be earning over a certain income, etc. But that's again highlights the lack of understanding about it. More than half of those with a pension lack confidence in its ability to provide a good standard of living in retirement. And that is very interesting. More than half of those with a pension believe it's not or are concerned about its ability to provide a decent level of lifestyle. Again, that points to the fact that an awful lot of people probably are making contributions, or perhaps it's because they do not have the ability to contribute more meaningfully, but they have a pension, but they're thinking this is not going to amount to much. It might buy a newspaper. So that's a concern. Okay. And again, it points to affordability issues that people face, which is a reality. But it also points to, okay, what can be done? What can be done? And interestingly enough, if people have long years of service, right? And this is something to be mindful of. If people have many years of service but have relatively small pensions, if they're long time with their employer, potentially in the last year or two, can there be contributions made by the individual or by the employer, and then the individual take up to 1.5 times final year salary as a tax-free lump sum. Okay, so it's a way of tax efficiently getting a lump sum, whatever, about building up a pension that's going to generate 4 or 5% income over years. If they have many years of service, then maybe target that maximum tax-free lump sum from the pot, and leave nothing else ultimately. That could be a consideration. Pension ownership is lowest among the 18 to 24-year-olds at 18%. So like 82% of people in that age category don't have a pension. Not surprising, of course. And that's the reality for the vast majority. It's way down the line. There may be affordability issues. They may be still in education. They may not see any value or benefit or need or affordability. That's not surprising. Worryingly, though, at 21% of those aged between 45 and 54 have no retirement arrangements in place. So 1 in 5 of those that are kind of in peak earnings category, if you will, have no pension arrangements in place, no retirement arrangements in place. So they haven't even thought about it. Why is this a problem? And why are these problems? You could say, well, look, that's the reality. That's the way it's always been. The real problem, if you ask me, it's not that 40% have no pension, or that there is a lack of awareness around auto enrollment or any other stat. For me, the problem is that most of us have given little to no thought or planning to funding our financial freedom. Whether that's through rental income or using savings or relying on inheritance or, I don't know, pensions, that we've given it no thought, or little or no thought. And of course, there are many who are struggling week to week, month to month, and for whom survival and making ends meet is the sole focus, right? That's not an easy place to be. For many, however, there are resources and choices and gratifications that could be delayed, and choices that could be made, and planning that can be done. They simply don't appear to do it. And why should they, you might say? Because they'll need the feckin' money. That's why. Unless they die during their careers, they're going to need the money. And I want to share 2 interesting pieces here. One is around, I guess, common consensus around what our spending might look like in retirement. And 2 is a real challenge to that I think is the crux of all of this. Okay. So many people will quote, and we've quoted it and discussed it and assessed it and analyzed it, and we look at it with clients, is around retirement spending, right? And what that will look like over a period of time, and how do you plan for that? Much of the research over the years states that retirement spending ultimately follows a U-shaped curve. The retirement smile, spending smile is how it might be described. And that is based on early years of retirement, which some tongue-in-cheek call go-go years. Then in the middle years of retirement, called the slow go years, where you're still going, but it's not quite as frenetic and expensive as it was in the early years of retirement. And then in later years, if you're fortunate to reach those, the no-go years, right? So the assumption is that in the go-go years, spending is high. May not be as high as your spending when you were working. All right. That's, again, the general consensus. And so you're doing lots of travel and fun stuff and going to shows and events and dinners and socializing and having fun. And maybe kids are still on the books to some degree, etc. Right? If you have children. And then, so it's there, right? And then it dips towards the middle years of retirement, the slow go years, as we said, some people call it. So activity slows, health constraints for a lot of people, our health span for many starts to reduce or diminish or expire here, ultimately, whatever lifespan. And then as we get to the later years, if we're fortunate to get there, the no-go years, our healthcare and support costs increase. And of course, other costs will expire and other expenses and lifestyle will expire, but they're replaced and often exceeded, is the general wisdom, by healthcare and support costs. All right. And CSO data for households age 65 plus show 40% less on transport than younger households. Fair enough. 50% less on recreation and culture, but more on health and only slightly less on food and housing, right? So some costs remain, some increase, and some expire. The message is clear though. Discretionary spend falls based on this research. Essentials remain. But is that reduction in spending in retirement by choice or enforced? So when you go from working to retired to that next chapter, the consensus is spending reduces, right? And it reduces over time, okay? And then ramps up if we get there based on health costs and support. Well, here is a challenging piece of research, a challenger piece of research, as it were. Spending can increase in retirement if we have it to spend. Okay, so there was a piece of research done now, it is 12 years ago, by Hurd and Roweather that I came across recently. And it is titled Heterogeneity in Spending Change at Retirement. Right. Now, what? Ultimately, they examined how spending changes when people retire. And they found that on average, there is only a small drop in total spending at the point of retirement and during retirement. There's only a small drop. Okay. Where the consensus for many is that, look, once you stop working, your spending will reduce by a third. Realistically, it will. Right. That kind of 2/3 of salary replacement will be grand. Whereas their findings were not necessarily the case. In fact, not at all the case for some. Their observations were that spending declines at retirement are small on average for total spending, but the upper half of wealth households see increases in spending after retirement. Increases. Right? They spend more in retirement. Those that have it to spend more in retirement than they did when they were working. So if their net incomes were 100 grand and their net expenditures were 100 grand a year pre-retirement, post-retirement, they were spending more than the 100. If they had it. The lower wealth households show larger spending declines, which tallies with the research that we always hear. And poor health is a big factor in early retirement and larger spending drops. Interesting. So where they don't have the ability nor the means. Some of the decline is explained by the cessation of work-related expenses. And this is back in 2013, of course, pre-COVID, when people might be working from home, less commuting costs and clothing, etc. You might only need to dress your top half, right? Which stops when working stops. But also another part comes from substitution, where people replace market purchase goods and services with home production or using their own time ultimately instead. But the key finding here is that for those that had more assets / incomes in retirement, results in us not reducing our spending. And that reducing spending appears to be enforced as opposed to a choice we want to make as a general rule. So ultimately, we need to, if we want to have greater level of choice in retirement, we need to have a greater level of assets and therefore incomes potentially in retirement to do so. That's the bottom line. The more we have, the more choice we'll have. Now, that's not to say that you'll go from being a prudent accumulator to a wanton spender and consumer of all things in sight. Not at all. But it ultimately points to the fact that the research that shows our spending will drop by a third in retirement, etc., is typically, their research suggests that it's typically driven by the fact that we have to reduce our spending. So what do we do about it? How do we encourage people and employees to plan for retirement? Going back to the CCPC research, how do we shift the dial there? How do we prepare for ourselves so that if we wanted to, that we could continue to spend the same or maybe even more if we wanted to? Well, ultimately, it's back to the basics. It's about start saving early. It will lead to higher investment growth, larger pots that could sustain our standard of living during retirement. So if we haven't started yet, start. If we were thinking of increasing, increase. If we were thinking of buying an asset that's going to generate income, buy the asset. We have more money sitting on deposit now than we ever had in all of history as a nation. Let's put it to use. And that doesn't necessarily mean buying a pension or buying an investment, but it means planning and thinking about how we're going to use those assets. Ultimately, if you're an employer or a manager or a team leader or business owner, help people thinking about their retirement goals. Help people assess the performance of what they're doing and figure out if what they're doing is the right thing or they could be doing X, Y, or Z. It's not your job as an employer to do that, of course, but to put your people and your team and your peers in contact with advisors or professionals who can do this and who do this. That's, facilitate that access properly and meaningfully. And so we work with some people who own businesses, and we've had conversations. They've engaged us to have conversations with their employees to help figure this stuff out. And that absolutely, over the course of multiple decades, those conversations can have massive impacts and differences for those people. So try and facilitate those conversations. But ultimately, try to build a retirement without smoke and mirrors. Like, ultimately, would you rather build a financial future lined with velvety cushions or one pieced together with old spud bags? That's ultimately what we're talking about here. According to some of the research that we see and that I've spoken about here, spending declines aren't voluntary. They're the result of dwindling means and necessity. And I see that myself. When working with clients where their asset level at retirement relative to their expenditure is low versus relative where their level of assets and incomes in retirement relative to expenditure is high. The difference in the choices that people make, it's very, very real. That's why this piece of research resonated with me. If we want our retirement to be defined by freedom, not by constraint, we need to look at the real numbers for ourselves around spending, but also in terms of accumulation and what we'll need and want to have by way of income. We need to stop kidding ourselves. We need to stop using those general rules of thumb, which are useful and can be helpful, but they're not personal, and personal finance is personal. We need to start planning and thinking and putting in place the actions that are going to help us achieve those things. And so this piece was, and today's podcast was to share the CCP research around the level of pension coverage, but to also challenge your thinking around what you will need and what you will want and how you're going to go about achieving it. And some of the steps that you can take to start moving closer to your goals if you're not already close enough. And whether that's for you or a loved one or a peer or colleague or team member, I do hope this helps you act. Thank you very much indeed for listening. You're a legend.